Welcome, time traveler. You've heard the horror stories about medieval torture, but what about the people doing it? This wasn't power. It was punishment. Behind every scream was a man slowly unraveling. This is the twisted, bloody reality of being a medieval torturer, and trust me, it sucked. You wake up in 1347, and everyone in your village knows what you do for a living. They cross themselves when you pass. Mothers pull their children indoors. The baker refuses to sell you bread, unless you pay double, and even then, he won't look you in the eye. You are a torturer, and in medieval Europe, that makes you one of the most despised people alive. But here's what's truly twisted about your situation. You never chose this profession. In most cases, the job was hereditary, passed down from father to son like a curse that couldn't be broken. Your grandfather was a torturer, your father was a torturer, and now you are too. The authorities didn't ask if you wanted to spend your days breaking bones and extracting confessions. They simply handed you the keys to the dungeon and expected you to get to work. What makes this even more bizarre is that medieval society desperately needed torturers, yet treated them as pariahs. The legal system of the time relied heavily on confessions to secure convictions, and torture was considered the most reliable way to obtain them. In France, the question ordinaire and question extraordinaire were standard legal procedures, formally codified and regulated by law. Without torturers, the entire judicial system would have collapsed. Yet you live in a strange social limbo. You're essential to maintaining order, but you're also considered spiritually contaminated. The Catholic Church taught that your work, while necessary, stained your soul. You cannot take communion without special dispensation from a bishop. You cannot be buried in consecrated ground unless you've performed acts of extreme penance. Some regions required torturers to wear distinctive clothing, a red cap or yellow stripe, so that decent Christians could identify and avoid them. The isolation is crushing. You live on the outskirts of town, often in a house provided by the local lord or magistrate. Your children, if you manage to find someone willing to marry you, will inherit not only your profession, but also your social ostracism. They will grow up knowing that half the town fears them and the other half considers them necessary evil. But here's what's most disturbing about your position. You're not just an executioner or a brute. You're required to be a skilled craftsman, a psychologist, and a medical expert all rolled into one. You must know exactly how much pain to inflict without causing death, how to read a person's breaking point, and how to keep someone conscious and responsive for hours. Your tools aren't just instruments of pain. They're precision devices that require years of training to master effectively. And yet, despite your expertise and the crucial role you play in medieval justice, you remain one of the most hated people in your community. You didn't start your career by breaking someone's limbs. At age 12, you began as an apprentice, and your first job was far more unsettling than you could have imagined. You had to learn to read people's faces while they screamed. Your master, a grizzled man named Heinrich, who had served the Duke of Brunswick for 30 years, explained that torture wasn't about brutality. It was about precision. A dead man tells no tales, he would say, but a man who thinks he's about to die tells everything. Your apprenticeship began with observation. You stood in the corner of dank stone chambers, watching Heinrich work, taking mental notes on technique, timing, and psychology. The tools of your trade were surprisingly sophisticated. The rack wasn't just a wooden frame with ropes, it was an engineered device with carefully calibrated pulleys and gears. Too much tension too quickly would dislocate joints permanently or cause death from shock. Too little, and the subject might endure the pain without confessing. You had to learn the exact amount of pressure that would cause excruciating pain without causing irreversible damage. But here's what truly shocked you during your apprenticeship. Many of your subjects were innocent. The legal principle of the time, established by Pope Innocent IV in 1252, stated that torture could be used when there was already half proof of guilt, meaning substantial suspicion, but not conclusive evidence. In practice, this meant that anyone accused of a serious crime could be tortured to extract a confession, regardless of actual guilt. You learn to recognize the different types of confessions. There were the immediate ones, people who broke after seeing the instruments, before any physical pain was applied. These were often the guilty ones who knew they'd been caught. Then there were the slow breaks, innocent people who eventually confessed to crimes they didn't commit because they couldn't endure any more pain. Your job was to extract confessions, not to determine truth. The psychological aspect of your training was perhaps the most disturbing. You learned that the anticipation of pain was often more effective than pain itself. The showing of instruments was a formal legal procedure, where suspected criminals were brought into the torture chamber and shown each device while its use was explained in vivid detail. Many confessions were obtained during this phase, before any physical torture began. You also discovered that your profession had its own professional standards and ethics. Yes, medieval torturers had ethical guidelines. You couldn't torture pregnant women, children under 14, or the elderly and infirm. Torture sessions couldn't exceed a certain duration, and there were specific rules about which body parts could be subjected to different types of pressure. These weren't humanitarian concerns. They were legal requirements designed to ensure that confessions would hold up in court. Your apprenticeship lasted 7 years, and by the end of it, you understood that you weren't just learning a trade. You were becoming a guardian of secrets that would haunt you forever. But the hardest lesson was yet to come. The date is October 15th, 1354, and you're 20 years old. Today, you'll conduct your first solo interrogation. Your hands shake as you light the brazier in the stone chamber beneath the courthouse in Regensburg. The subject is a baker named Klaus, accused of poisoning the communion wafers that killed 3 parishioners last Sunday. What you didn't expect was how normal Klaus would seem. He's 43 years old, with flour still under his fingernails, and worry lines etched deep around his eyes. He has a wife and 4 children. He keeps asking about them, begging you to tell him they're safe. You know they're not. Suspected heretics' families are rarely left alone, but you can't tell him that. Your job is to extract his confession, not provide comfort. The legal document authorizing the interrogation sits on a wooden table near the wall. It's written in Latin, which you can barely read, but you know what it says. Klaus must confess to heresy, witchcraft, or conspiracy against the church. The evidence against him is thin. 3 people died after taking communion, and Klaus baked the bread. But in medieval logic, this is enough to warrant extraordinary measures. You begin with the standard procedure, showing the instruments. You explain each device in detail, watching Klaus's face grow paler with each description. The thumb screws, designed to crush fingernails and the bones beneath them. The strapado, which would dislocate his shoulders by hoisting him up by his arms twisted behind his back. The foot press, which would slowly crush the bones in his feet until they were nothing but pulp. What disturbs you most is Klaus's reaction. He doesn't protest his innocence with the indignation of a wrongly accused man. Instead, he seems resigned, almost relieved. "I wondered when you would come for me," he says quietly. "Ever since the deaths, I've been waiting." This confession of expectation isn't the same as a confession of guilt, and you know it. But the legal system doesn't make such fine distinctions. The fact that Klaus expected to be accused is noted in the record as evidence of consciousness of guilt. You strap Klaus to the rack, adjusting the ropes according to your training. His wrists are bound with leather straps designed to tighten under pressure, but not cut off circulation entirely. A dead subject can't confess, and damaged hands can't sign confession documents. As you begin to turn the wheel, applying pressure to his joints, Klaus begins to pray. Not for salvation or forgiveness, but for his children. Please, he gasps as the first wave of real pain hits him. Don't let them starve. This is the moment you realize the true horror of your profession. It's not the infliction of pain that will haunt you. It's the intimate knowledge of your subjects' deepest fears and loves. You're not just breaking their bodies. You're witnessing the destruction of their entire world. And you're just getting started. After 2 hours, Klaus confesses to making a pact with the devil to poison the communion wafers. You know he's lying. The confession is textbook. Exactly the kind of story torture subjects tell when they can't endure any more pain. But your job isn't to determine truth. Your job is to obtain a legally admissible confession. And you've done that, But as you unlock Klaus's restraints and help him sign his confession with a trembling hand, you can't shake the feeling that you've just participated in something far more evil than anything Klaus might have actually done. Your workshop is located in the basement of your house, and it's filled with instruments that would make a modern surgeon envious of their precision. Each tool has been crafted by the finest metal workers in the region, because your profession demands nothing less than perfection. A poorly made thumbscrew might kill the subject too quickly. A badly balanced strappado rope might snap at the crucial moment. Your tools are investments in effectiveness. The rack is your most important piece of equipment, and it costs more than most peasants earn in 5 years. Made from seasoned oak and fitted with iron gears forged by the same smiths who make siege engines, it's a marvel of medieval engineering. The gear ratio is precisely calculated to apply incremental pressure. Each turn of the wheel stretches the subject's body exactly 3 inches. You can control the process with mathematical precision. But here's what's truly disturbing about your tools. Many of them were designed by monks and clergy. Brother Augustine of the Dominican monastery in Cologne invented the Spanish boot, a metal casing that fit over the leg and could be slowly tightened until it crushed the bones inside. His design notes, preserved in monastery archives, show the same careful attention to detail that went into illuminated manuscripts. The thumbscrews in your collection are works of art. Each one is engraved with religious symbols, crosses, saints, biblical verses about justice and confession. The irony isn't lost on you. Instruments of torture decorated with symbols of divine mercy. The craftsman who made them, a devout Catholic named Johann Weiss, blessed each tool before delivery. He believed he was creating instruments of God's justice. Your medical knowledge rivals that of any physician in the region. You understand human anatomy better than most doctors because you need to know exactly what happens when each bone breaks. Each joint dislocates, each nerve is compressed. You can tell the difference between the sound of a shoulder separating and a rib cracking. You know which types of pain cause fainting and which maintain consciousness. The psychological tools are often more effective than the physical ones. You own a collection of detailed woodcut illustrations showing various torture methods, designed specifically to be shown to subjects before questioning begins. These images were created by the same artists who illustrated prayer books and Bibles. The artistry is exceptional. Every detail of pain and suffering rendered with the same skill used to depict the martyrdom of saints. Your record keeping is meticulous. Medieval law requires detailed documentation of every torture session. You maintain ledgers noting the time of day each session began, the specific techniques used, the duration of each application, and the exact wording of any confessions obtained. These records are legal documents that can be reviewed by higher courts or church authorities. But the tool you use most often isn't made of metal or wood. It's your voice. You've learned to modulate your tone to maximum psychological effect. Sometimes you speak gently, like a confessor priest, encouraging subjects to unburden their souls. Other times you describe upcoming procedures in clinical detail, letting anticipation do the work for you. You've discovered that a whispered threat is often more effective than a shouted one. What disturbs you most about your workshop is how ordinary it looks when not in use. The tools hang on wooden pegs like any craftsman's implements. The rack could be mistaken for a carpenter's workbench. The brazier looks like something used for heating a home. It's only when these items are used for their intended purpose that their true horror becomes apparent. And yet, despite the sophistication of your equipment and the precision of your techniques, you can't escape one troubling reality. Your tools are far more reliable than your ability to determine who actually deserves to feel their touch. By 1358, you've learned that the human mind breaks in predictable patterns, and this knowledge makes your job both easier and infinitely more disturbing. You've developed what medieval scholars would have called empirical knowledge, understanding, based on repeated observation and experience. Modern psychologists would recognize your techniques as sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation, but you simply call it reading the signs. The first stage is always denial, usually accompanied by desperate protestations of innocence. You've learned not to begin physical torture during this phase. Instead, you use environmental pressure, the cold stone chamber, the flickering torchlight. That creates dancing shadows, the smell of fear and old blood that permeates the walls. Most subjects begin to crack within the first hour of simply being in the room. The second stage is bargaining. This is when subjects begin to offer information about other crimes or other people, hoping to trade their way out of their current predicament. Here's where your job becomes truly insidious. These bargaining confessions often produce new suspects, creating a spiral of accusations that can destroy entire communities. In 1356, a single torture session with a suspected horse thief in Munster led to accusations against 17 other people, including a priest and 2 noblewomen. You've observed that different types of people break in different ways. Merchants and craftsmen, accustomed to negotiation, often try to bargain their way out with offers of money or information. Peasants, used to accepting authority without question, often confess quickly to end their suffering. Nobles, trained from birth to show no weakness, sometimes endure extraordinary pain before breaking, but when they do break, their confessions are often the most elaborate and creative. The breaking point isn't usually triggered by physical pain alone. It's the moment when subjects realize that their suffering is meaningless. You've learned to recognize this moment. The eyes go flat, the body stops struggling against restraints, and the voice changes to a monotone. This is when you know that whatever comes next will be a confession, whether true or false. What's most disturbing is how quickly you've learned to manufacture false memories. Through careful questioning and suggestion, you can guide subjects toward confessing to specific crimes in specific ways. If the authorities need someone to confess to witchcraft, you know exactly which questions to ask and in what order. If they need details about heretical meetings, you can extract elaborate descriptions of events that never happened. Your psychological toolkit includes techniques that won't be formally studied for another 6 centuries. You use what modern psychology calls learned helplessness, creating conditions where subjects believe they have no control over their situation. You employ anchoring bias, introducing specific details early in questioning that influence all subsequent responses. You understand cognitive dissonance, the mental stress that occurs when beliefs conflict with evidence. The most effective psychological technique in your arsenal is the false friend method. After hours of torture, you present yourself as the subject's only ally, the one person who might show mercy or understanding. Subjects who have been brutally treated often develop a desperate attachment to anyone who shows them the slightest kindness. They begin to see their torturer as their savior rather than their tormentor. You've also discovered that physical and psychological torture work in synergy. A person can often endure severe physical pain if they believe it serves a purpose or will end eventually. But combine that pain with psychological uncertainty, not knowing when it will stop or what will happen next, and resistance crumbles much more quickly. Your records show that 73% of your subjects confess before any severe physical torture is applied. They break from anticipation, uncertainty, and psychological pressure alone. This statistic would fascinate and horrify future researchers. But to you, it's simply evidence of your growing expertise. But there's one pattern you've noticed that troubles you deeply. The longer you work in this profession, the better you become at recognizing innocence ... and the less it seems to matter. Your house stands at the edge of town, deliberately positioned so that decent Christians don't have to encounter you during their daily lives. The local bishop insisted on this placement when you inherited your position, explaining that your spiritual contamination might affect others. But what the bishop didn't anticipate was how this isolation would create its own strange community. You're not the only social outcast living on the margins. Your neighbors include the town's executioner, 2 grave diggers, a woman who prepares corpses for burial, and a man whose job is to clean the public latrines. Together, you form an unlikely fellowship of the spiritually damned, people whose work is considered necessary but morally contaminating. The executioner, a massive man named Burnt, has become your closest friend. Like you, he inherited his profession from his father, and like you, he struggles with the weight of what he does. Unlike you, however, his work is quick and final. He envies you this. At least when I take a head, the suffering ends, he often says. You must live with the knowledge of what you've extracted from people's souls. Your social isolation extends beyond mere housing arrangements. The local tavern keeper will serve you ale, but only if you drink it outside. The blacksmith will repair your tools, but he charges you triple the normal rate and insists on payment in advance. The priest at the local church will hear your confession, but only in a separate chamber, and only after the regular parishioners have left. Marriage prospects are virtually non-existent. The few women who might consider marrying into your profession are typically widows of other executioners or torturers, or occasionally the daughters of other social outcasts. When you finally marry Helena, the widow of the previous torturer in Munich, it's less a romantic choice than a practical arrangement. Between 2 people who understand the unique burdens of your profession, Elena brings her own horrors to your marriage. She's witnessed her first husband's work for 15 years, and she understands the nightmares, the sudden flinching at unexpected sounds, the way you sometimes talk in your sleep about people whose names she recognizes from court records. She knows not to ask about your work, and you know not to discuss the details of what happens in the chamber below. Your children face a particularly cruel inheritance. Little Hans, now 7 years old, already shows the signs of social ostracism that will define his life. Other children aren't allowed to play with him. Their parents whisper that evil might be hereditary, that growing up in a torturer's house might corrupt his soul. The local schoolmaster, Brother Francis, initially refused to teach him, relenting only when you paid triple the usual fees. What's most disturbing about your social position is how it affects your relationship with your subjects. In the torture chamber, you hold absolute power over another human being. You can inflict unimaginable pain or grant merciful relief. But outside that chamber, you're treated as lower than the people you torture. Some of your subjects, particularly nobles or wealthy merchants, would ordinarily never acknowledge someone of your social status. The torture chamber is the only place where social hierarchies are temporarily suspended. The church's position on your spiritual status creates additional complications. You're required to attend Mass, but you must sit in a designated area separated from the congregation. You can take communion, but only after special purification rituals. When you die, you can be buried in consecrated ground, but only if your family can provide evidence that you performed adequate penance for your professional sins. This spiritual isolation affects every aspect of your life. When Helena became pregnant with Hans, the midwife initially refused to attend the birth, claiming that delivering a torturer's child might contaminate her own soul. Your business relationships are conducted through intermediaries whenever possible. Legal documents often require you to use a special mark rather than your name, as if writing your actual name might spread spiritual pollution. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of your isolation is how it prevents you from discussing the psychological burden of your work with anyone who might understand. You're surrounded by people who need your services, but despise you for providing them, creating a loneliness that cuts deeper than any physical pain you've ever inflicted. The year is 1363, and the Black Death has returned to sweep through your region for the second time in a generation. What you don't expect is how profoundly this pandemic will change your profession, and how it will reveal the true depths of medieval society's capacity for paranoia and cruelty. As bodies pile up in the streets and entire families disappear within days, the surviving population desperately searches for someone to blame. Jews are the first targets, accused of poisoning wells. Then comes suspicion of foreigners, heretics, and anyone whose behavior seems unusual. But what's most disturbing is how quickly accusations turn toward anyone who might have made a deal with the devil to spare themselves from the plague. Your services are suddenly in unprecedented demand. Local authorities, terrified by the epidemic and pressured by panicked citizens, begin rounding up suspected plague spreaders on the flimsiest evidence. A woman whose family hasn't died while her neighbors perish becomes suspect. A merchant who continues trading while others fall ill must be in league with evil forces. Anyone who claims to have a cure or protection is obviously practicing witchcraft. You find yourself working 12-hour days in chambers that reek of death and desperation. The sheer volume of cases means you must develop more efficient techniques. Where you once might spend days carefully extracting a confession, you now have hours at most before the next subject is brought in. This rushed pace leads to a horrifying innovation. You begin using group torture sessions, interrogating multiple suspects simultaneously to save time. What's most disturbing about these plague-era torture sessions is how eagerly people confess to impossible crimes. A baker's wife confesses to flying to diabolic meetings where she learned to spread plague through cursed bread. An elderly man admits to transforming into a wolf to carry the disease from house to house. A priest confesses to consecrating communion, wafers with infected blood. The confessions become increasingly elaborate and fantastic as the plague hysteria grows. You begin to realize that torture during plague times isn't really about extracting truth. It's about providing psychological relief to a traumatized population. People need to believe that the plague has human causes that can be identified and eliminated. Random, meaningless death is too terrifying to accept. Better to believe in evil conspiracies that can be rooted out through pain and confession. Legal standards that once governed your work begin to break down under the pressure of mass hysteria. Due process becomes a luxury that plague-ravaged communities can't afford. Evidence requirements are relaxed, torture time limits are extended, and previously protected groups, pregnant women, the elderly, children, begin appearing in your chamber with increasing frequency. Your own family isn't immune to the paranoia. Neighbors begin to whisper that your house has been suspiciously untouched by plague. How is it that a torturous family remains healthy while pious Christians die? Helena becomes afraid to leave the house. Hans is accused of carrying evil from your workplace into the community. You realize that your profession, once merely despised, has become actively dangerous. The psychological toll of plague-era torture work is unlike anything you've experienced. Previously, you could tell yourself that you were extracting genuine confessions from actual criminals. Now you know with absolute certainty that you're torturing innocent people into confessing to impossible crimes. The woman screaming on your rack didn't make a pact with the devil. The man begging for mercy didn't poison the town well. They're simply convenient scapegoats for a community driven mad by grief and terror. But perhaps most disturbing of all is your growing realization that the authorities don't care whether the confessions are true. They need scapegoats to burn, and your job is to provide legally admissible confessions that justify the executions. Truth has become irrelevant. Your expertise in reading guilt and innocence has become meaningless. You're no longer a craftsman extracting justice. You're a factory worker producing the raw material for public catharsis. And as the plague continues its relentless spread, you can't shake the feeling that your own reckoning is approaching. In the winter of 1365, they bring you a subject who will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. Brother Thomas is a Franciscan monk accused of preaching that the church has become too wealthy and corrupt, that salvation comes through personal prayer rather than ecclesiastical hierarchy. These beliefs, considered dangerously heretical by church authorities, have earned him a one-way trip to your chamber. What's immediately different about Brother Thomas is his demeanor. Most subjects arrive in various states of terror, weeping, praying frantically, begging, or sometimes catatonic with fear. Thomas enters your chamber calmly, looks around with what appears to be genuine curiosity, and asks if he might pray. Briefly before you begin, his composure is so unsettling that you almost grant the request. The torture begins with standard procedures. You show him the instruments, explaining their use in detail as required by law. Thomas listens attentively, occasionally nodding as if you're describing carpentry tools rather than devices designed to cause excruciating pain. When you describe the strappado, he asks technical questions about the rope mechanisms. When you explain the thumb screws, he comments on the craftsmanship of the metalwork. His response to actual torture is unlike anything you've encountered. On the rack, as pressure builds in his joints, Thomas begins to recite biblical passages about suffering and redemption. But these aren't desperate pleas for divine intervention. They're scholarly discussions of theological concepts, delivered as if he's lecturing to students rather than being stretched toward the breaking point of human endurance. After 3 hours of systematic torture, Thomas hasn't confessed to heresy. Instead, he's used the time to deliver a comprehensive critique of contemporary church practices, complete with citations from Scripture and early church fathers. He argues his points calmly, even while his shoulders are being dislocated, pausing only occasionally to acknowledge that yes, the pain is quite severe, but no, it doesn't change his theological positions. What disturbs you most is Thomas's apparent compassion for you during the process. Between applications of torture, he asks about your family, expresses concern for the spiritual burden your profession must place on your soul, and even offers to pray for your salvation. He seems genuinely worried about the effect his torture might have on your conscience, rather than the effect it's having on his body. By the 5th day, church authorities begin to worry. Thomas's resistance is becoming legendary among the local population. Word spreads that a holy man is being tortured for speaking truth about church corruption. Some begin to whisper that Thomas might be a genuine saint, that his ability to endure torture without renouncing his beliefs is evidence of a divine favor. You're ordered to intensify your methods, to use techniques normally reserved for the most hardened criminals. The Spanish boot is applied to Thomas's legs with increasing pressure until you can hear bones cracking. His response is to begin singing hymns in Latin, his voice remaining surprisingly steady despite obvious agony. When you apply heated metal to his flesh, he discusses the theological significance of Christ's suffering on the cross. On the seventh day, something unprecedented happens. Thomas begins converting other prisoners. His voice, carrying through the stone walls of the dungeon, reaches other cells where accused heretics and criminals await their turn with you. They begin singing along with his hymns. Some start refusing to confess their own crimes, claiming they've been inspired by Thomas's example of righteous resistance. Church authorities realize they have a serious problem. Thomas's resistance is undermining the entire torture-based interrogation system. If word spreads that someone can endure unlimited torture without breaking, it might inspire others to refuse confession. The psychological foundation of your profession, that everyone breaks eventually, is being publicly challenged. The solution they devise is perhaps more disturbing than anything you've done with your tools. Rather than continue torturing Thomas until he dies, which would create a martyr, they order you to stop. Thomas will be declared mentally incompetent due to his refusal to confess obvious guilt. He'll be quietly transferred to a monastery prison where he'll spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement. As you unlock Thomas's restraints for the final time, he places his damaged hand on your shoulder and says something that will echo in your mind forever. I forgive you, and I pray that someday you'll forgive yourself. You realize that for the first time in your career, you've encountered someone whose spirit proves stronger than your expertise in breaking it. The year 1367 brings an event that will test the darkest limits of your profession, a mass hysteria involving children accused of witchcraft. It begins innocuously enough when 8-year-old Greta, daughter of a wool merchant, claims to have seen the devil dancing with several local women in the forest outside town. Within weeks, her story has grown into accusations against 37 people, including some of the town's most respected citizens. What makes this situation unique is that the primary witnesses are children, aged 6 to 14. Medieval law generally protected minors from torture, but these children aren't subjects, they're accusers. And their accusations are so detailed, so consistent, and so disturbing that local authorities become convinced they've uncovered a massive diabolic conspiracy threatening the entire community. The first adult you're ordered to interrogate is Marguerite, the baker's wife, whom little Greta claims taught her to fly. Marguerite has lived in this town for 30 years, raised 5 children, and never been accused of anything more serious than occasionally shortchanging customers on bread. Wait. Yet here she is, strapped to your rack, accused of supernatural crimes, based on a child's testimony. What disturbs you most about this case is how the children's stories influence your interrogation techniques. Normally, you might start with general questions and gradually guide subjects toward specific confessions. But the children have provided such detailed accounts of diabolic meetings, ritual practices, and supernatural abilities that you find yourself asking leading questions designed to confirm these pre-existing narratives. Marguerite's responses follow a pattern you're beginning to recognize in these child witness cases. She initially denies everything with genuine bewilderment, unable to understand why anyone would believe such fantastic accusations. But as the torture intensifies, she begins incorporating elements from the children's stories into her responses. Not because she remembers doing these things, but because the pain makes her desperate to say whatever might make it stop. That the confession you eventually extract from Marguerite is a masterpiece of induced false memory. She admits to attending diabolic meetings where she learned to transform into a wolf, to flying through the night sky to damage crops, and to teaching children how to call upon demons. Every detail matches the children's testimony perfectly, because you've carefully guided her toward confirming their specific claims. But here's what truly horrifies you. As you conduct more interrogations based on children's accusations, you begin to realize that the children are learning from each successive confession. Each torture session produces new details that somehow find their way into the children's subsequent testimony. The accusations and confessions are feeding off each other, creating an ever-expanding narrative of supernatural evil. Young Greta, the original accuser, becomes a regular visitor to the courthouse, eager to hear about each new confession and quick to expand her accusations based on what she learns. You watch her transform from a frightened child telling what she believed was the truth into something far more disturbing, a sophisticated manipulator who seems to enjoy the power her accusations give her over adults. The psychological dynamics become increasingly complex as more children join the accusations. Some appear genuinely convinced they've witnessed supernatural events. Others seem motivated by attention and importance they've never experienced before. A few appear to be settling scores against adults who've previously disciplined or disappointed them. But they all share one characteristic. They've discovered that their words can literally determine who lives and dies. Your interrogation techniques are forced to evolve to handle this unprecedented situation. Traditional torture methods were designed to extract truth from guilty parties or force false confessions from innocent ones. But these cases involve extracting false confessions that must match the false testimonies of children who may themselves believe their lies are truth. The most disturbing session occurs when you're ordered to interrogate Johann, the town's priest, accused by the children of conducting blasphemous rituals during midnight masses. Johann has served this community for 20 years, baptizing many of the children who now accuse him. As you apply pressure to extract his confession, he weeps not from pain but from heartbreak at the betrayal by children he helped raise. His confession, when it finally comes, is perhaps the most elaborate you've ever recorded. Johann admits to desecrating communion wafers, teaching diabolic prayers to children, and using his position to recruit new members for Satan's army. The confession is theologically sophisticated and entirely false, crafted to match the children's accusations while satisfying church authorities' need for a complete explanation of how their trusted priest could have been corrupted. As the children's crusade of accusations continues to spread, consuming more lives and destroying more families, you can't escape one terrifying realization. You've become an expert at manufacturing the evidence needed to justify a community's decision to destroy itself. In the spring of 1369, your chamber receives its most challenging subject yet, Count Wilhelm von Hartenberg, accused of treason against the Holy Roman Emperor. This case will test every aspect of your professional expertise while forcing you to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics and social hierarchy. The charges against Count Wilhelm are serious but complex. He's accused of corresponding with French agents, providing military intelligence about imperial fortifications, and accepting gold in exchange for strategic information. The evidence includes intercepted letters bearing seals that appear to be his, testimony from captured French spies who claim to know him, and reports of suspicious meetings with foreign merchants at his castle. What complicates your situation is that Count Wilhelm outranks everyone involved in his prosecution except the emperor himself. Medieval law recognizes different standards of justice for different social classes, and torturing a count requires special authorization and procedures. You've been provided with papal dispensation allowing his interrogation, but the political implications of this case extend far beyond your dungeon walls. Count Wilhelm arrives at your chamber with an entourage. That includes his personal chaplain, his legal advocate, and 2 witnesses of noble birth who will observe the proceedings to ensure proper treatment. This is the first time in your career that your torture session has an audience of equals to your subject. and their presence fundamentally changes the dynamics of the interrogation. The Count himself presents a fascinating study in medieval nobility. Under extreme stress, he's 53 years old, battle-scarred from numerous campaigns, and accustomed to commanding absolute obedience from those beneath him. Yet here he is, required by law to submit to torture at the hands of someone he would normally consider barely human. The cognitive dissonance is evident in his behavior, alternating between imperious demands for respect and grudging acknowledgement of his current powerlessness. His standard intimidation techniques prove largely ineffective against someone who's faced death in combat numerous times. The showing of instruments doesn't terrify Count Wilhelm. Instead, he examines each device with professional interest, commenting on their craftsmanship and comparing them to torture devices he's seen used on captured enemies during his military campaigns. The actual torture process becomes a strange negotiation between social protocol and legal necessity. Count Wilhelm requests that his restraints be applied by you personally rather than by assistants, claiming it's more dignified to be bound by a master craftsman than by apprentices. He asks permission to pray before each new application of torture, and remarkably, he conducts these prayers in Latin with the same formal dignity he might use when receiving communion. What's most unsettling about torturing nobility is how it reveals the arbitrary nature of social hierarchy. In normal circumstances, Count Wilhelm could have you executed for disrespect. In this chamber, you hold absolute power over his body, while he retains social authority over the process. When you apply the thumbscrews to his hands, the same hands that once signed death warrants for peasants who poached on his lands, the reversal of power relationships creates an almost surreal atmosphere. The Count's resistance to torture is remarkable, but different from Brother Thomas's spiritual endurance. Wilhelm approaches the experience like a military campaign, rationing his strength, analyzing your techniques, and attempting to negotiate the terms of his suffering. He offers to provide partial confessions in exchange for reduced torture, proposes limitations on which techniques can be used, and even suggests scheduling breaks at regular intervals. His noble witnesses complicate your work in unexpected ways. They're required to observe and record the proceedings, but they're also clearly uncomfortable watching a member of their own class being tortured. Their presence forces you to maintain higher standards of professionalism. You can't use the casual brutality that might work with peasant subjects. Every technique must be applied with precision and justified by legal necessity. The breakthrough comes on the third day, when Count Wilhelm realizes that his resistance is endangering his family. Imperial investigators have begun questioning his wife and eldest son, and there are hints that their interrogations might move beyond mere questioning if Wilhelm continues to resist. Faced with the possibility that his suffering might spread to his loved ones, his resolve begins to crack. The confession he provides is politically sophisticated and strategically calculated. Wilhelm admits to accepting French gold, but claims it was part of a double-agent operation intended to feed false information to enemy spies. He confesses to meetings with foreign agents, but insists they were conducted with imperial knowledge and approval. His story is crafted to minimize his treason while providing enough detail to satisfy his interrogators. What disturbs you most about this case is how it demonstrates that even your expertise in breaking people is subject to political considerations beyond your control. Count Wilhelm's confession isn't evaluated based on its truth or the quality of your extraction techniques. It's assessed based on its usefulness to various political factions within the imperial court. The Count is ultimately sentenced to house arrest rather than execution, his noble status providing protection that no commoner would receive for identical crimes. His confession becomes a political document used to justify policy changes and personnel shifts within the imperial administration. The truth of his guilt or innocence becomes irrelevant compared to the confession's utility as propaganda. As you unlock Wilhelm's restraints for the final time, he makes a request that will haunt you. He asks for your professional assessment of whether his confession was believable. Even after days of torture, he's still thinking like a politician, concerned about how his words will be received and interpreted by those who weren't present to witness his suffering. The case leaves you with a disturbing realization. Your profession serves power rather than justice, and the higher you climb in the social hierarchy, the more obvious this becomes. The autumn of 1371 brings a figure who will transform your work in ways both fascinating and horrifying. Heinrich Kramer, an inquisitor and self-proclaimed expert in identifying and prosecuting witches. He arrives in your region with papal authorization to root out diabolic influences, and his methods will push your profession into previously unimaginable territory. Kramer is unlike any church official you've encountered. Where most clerics treat your profession as a necessary evil, he embraces it as a holy calling. He speaks of torture not as punishment or interrogation, but as a form of spiritual warfare against Satan himself. In his worldview, suspected witches aren't merely criminals, they're enemy soldiers in a cosmic battle between good and evil. What's immediately apparent about Kramer's approach is his systematic methodology. He arrives with detailed questionnaire designed to identify witches, comprehensive lists of signs and symptoms of diabolic influence, and specific torture protocols tailored to extract particular types of confessions. This isn't the ad hoc judicial torture you've practiced for decades. It's an industrialized process designed for mass production of witch confessions. The first subject Kramer brings you is Anna, a midwife accused of causing stillbirths through supernatural means. What's different about this interrogation is Kramer's presence throughout the session. He doesn't simply provide you with questions and leave. He remains in the chamber, guiding the interrogation in real time and adjusting tactics based on Anna's responses. Kramer's techniques are sophisticated beyond anything you've learned. He understands that accused witches often genuinely believe in their own supernatural abilities, having been raised in communities where magical thinking is commonplace. Rather than torture them into false confessions, he tortures them into elaborate, true confessions of activities they actually attempted, even if those activities were objectively harmless. Anna, under Kramer's guided interrogation, confesses to using herbs and incantations to influence births. She describes attempting to communicate with spirits, performing rituals she believed would protect mothers during childbirth, and creating potions designed to ease labor pains. None of these activities actually caused the stillbirths she's accused of, but in Kramer's framework, the intention to use supernatural powers makes her guilty of witchcraft regardless of effectiveness. What disturbs you most about working with Kramer is his genuine, scholarly interest in the details of diabolic practice. He takes extensive notes on every confession, cross-references them with previous cases, and develops increasingly sophisticated theories about how witchcraft operates. He's not simply extracting confessions to satisfy legal requirements. He's conducting research into what he believes is a genuine supernatural threat. Kramer introduces you to torture techniques specifically designed for witch trials. The swimming test determines guilt or innocence by whether the subject floats or sinks when thrown into water. Floating indicates diabolic buoyancy. Sinking proves innocence, though it often results in drowning. The pricking test searches for areas of skin that don't bleed when pierced, supposedly indicating spots where the devil has touched the subject. Your professional relationship with Kramer becomes increasingly complex as you work together. He respects your technical expertise while considering your spiritual understanding inadequate. He teaches you to recognize signs of demonic possession during torture sessions, speaking in unknown languages, displaying supernatural strength, or providing knowledge the subject shouldn't possess. The volume of witch trials under Kramer's supervision dramatically increases your workload. Where you previously handled perhaps 20 cases per year, Kramer's systematic approach generates over 100 witch accusations in his first 6 months. Your chamber operates almost continuously, with subjects processed in efficient rotation. To maximize confessions while minimizing deaths from torture. What's most unsettling is how Kramer's presence changes the nature of your confessions. Previously, torture subjects would eventually say whatever they thought you wanted to hear to end their suffering. Under Kramer's guidance, they provide detailed, consistent accounts of diabolic meetings, supernatural abilities, and evil conspiracies. That align perfectly with his theoretical framework. The confessions become increasingly elaborate and interconnected. Each witch identifies other witches, describes shared rituals, and provides details about diabolic hierarchies and meeting places. What emerges is a comprehensive picture of an alleged supernatural conspiracy involving hundreds of people across multiple communities. You begin to realize that Kramer isn't simply prosecuting individual criminals. He's creating evidence for a worldview that sees diabolic influence everywhere. Each confession validates his theories while generating new accusations, creating a self-perpetuating system that transforms isolated incidents of folk magic into evidence of cosmic evil. But the most disturbing aspect of working with Kramer is how his systematic approach makes you more effective at your job while making you increasingly uncertain about its moral foundations. His methods produce more detailed confessions with less physical torture, but they also transform you from a craftsman extracting individual truths into a factory worker mass-producing evidence for predetermined conclusions. As Kramer's influence spreads and witch trials multiply across the region, you can't shake the feeling that you've become part of something far larger and more dangerous than anything you've participated in before. By 1374, your profession has evolved into something you barely recognize from your early apprenticeship. A complex economic system where pain has become a commodity with standardized prices, regulated quality controls, and market-driven demand. Fluctuations. The transformation begins with administrative efficiency requirements imposed by church and secular authorities. Your torture sessions must now be documented with unprecedented detail, including itemized costs for equipment usage, facility rental, and professional services. A standard rack session costs the equivalent of 3 days' wages for a skilled craftsman. Thumbscrew applications are priced per digit. The Strapato commands premium rates due to the specialized rigging required. What's most disturbing about this commercialization is how it affects your relationship with subjects. You're no longer simply extracting confessions. You're providing measured quantities of suffering, calculated to justify predetermined legal expenses. A minor theft accusation receives basic interrogation services. Heresy charges warrant comprehensive torture packages. Witchcraft allegations demand deluxe treatment. Protocols with extended session durations. The economic pressures create perverse incentives that corrupt the entire judicial process. Local magistrates discover that torture-based prosecutions generate revenue through confiscated property of convicted subjects. Accusations against wealthy merchants or landowners become particularly attractive because successful prosecutions yield valuable assets that can be divided between church and secular authorities. Your professional fees are structured to encourage thorough confessions rather than quick resolutions. You receive base payment for conducting interrogations, but bonus payments for extracting confessions that lead to additional arrests. This incentive system transforms you from an impartial investigator into a commission-based salesman of legal conclusions. The standardization of torture procedures creates an unexpected consequence. Subjects begin developing resistance strategies based on economic calculations rather than physical endurance. Wealthy defendants hire advisors who coach them on confession timing, providing just enough information to satisfy legal requirements while minimizing additional torture expenses. Poor defendants, unable to afford strategic advice, often endure unnecessarily prolonged suffering. Equipment maintenance becomes a significant business expense requiring careful budgeting. Your rack needs monthly inspections and occasional replacement of worn components. Thumb screws require regular cleaning and lubrication to function properly. The strapeo ropes must be tested for tensile strength and replaced when fraying threatens operational safety. These costs are passed through to customers via service fees added to legal proceedings. The most unsettling economic development is the emergence of competitive market pressures. Other torturers in neighboring regions begin offering innovative techniques or reduced pricing to attract business from local authorities. You're forced to develop specializations and unique selling propositions to maintain your market position. Your expertise in witch interrogations becomes a valuable competitive advantage that commands premium pricing. Professional development becomes necessary to remain economically viable. You attend regional conferences where torturers share techniques, discuss equipment innovations, and network with potential clients. These gatherings have the bizarre atmosphere of trade shows, complete with equipment demonstrations and professional certification programs that the church develops increasingly sophisticated financial instruments around torture-based prosecutions. Advance payment plans allow authorities to spread torture costs across multiple budget periods. Volume discounts encourage comprehensive prosecutions of multiple suspects. Payment deferrals permit immediate interrogations with costs recovered from confiscated assets of convicted subjects. Your accounting records reveal disturbing patterns in the economics of pain. Witch trials generate the highest profit margins due to their complexity and duration. Heresy cases provide steady, predictable income streams. Common criminal prosecutions operate on thin margins but offer reliable volume. These economic realities begin influencing which types of cases receive the most thorough attention. The commercialization extends to ancillary services surrounding your core business. You begin offering consultation on interrogation planning, expert testimony regarding confession reliability, and training services for apprentice torturers in other regions. These diversification strategies prove more profitable than direct torture work while requiring less physical and psychological investment. Quality control measures are implemented to ensure consistent service delivery across different types of cases. Standardized confession templates streamline documentation processes. Performance metrics track interrogation success rates and customer satisfaction scores. Professional insurance policies protect against liability claims arising from excessive torture or subject deaths during questioning. What disturbs you most about this economic evolution is how it transforms the moral weight of your profession into mere business considerations. The question is no longer whether someone deserves to be tortured, but whether their case generates sufficient revenue to justify the resource investment. Human suffering has been reduced to line items in ledger books, but perhaps most troubling is your growing realization that this economic system creates powerful incentives for authorities to generate accusations regardless of actual guilt. Because the torture and prosecution process itself has become a significant source of institutional revenue. The year 1376 marks the beginning of your psychological collapse, though you won't recognize it as such for months to come. It starts with small symptoms that you dismiss as occupational hazards: difficulty sleeping, sudden startled reactions to unexpected sounds, and an inexplicable reluctance to enter your own torture chamber. The catalyst is a case that seems routine at first. Martha, a seamstress accused of using diabolic powers to cause cloth to tear during sewing, thereby sabotaging competitors' businesses. The charges are absurd even by the standards of witch trial accusations. But the economic pressures of your profession demand that you treat every case with professional thoroughness. Martha is 62 years old, arthritic, and so frightened, when brought to your chamber, that she can barely speak coherently. Her terror is so complete that she confesses immediately upon seeing the torture instruments, before any physical pain is applied. She admits to making pacts with demons, attending diabolic meetings, and using supernatural powers to damage others. Seamstress's work, what breaks something fundamental inside you, is the realization that Martha's confession is textbook perfect precisely because it's completely manufactured. Every detail matches standard witch trial narratives, not because she actually performed these acts, but because years of torture sessions have taught her exactly what kind of story will satisfy authorities and end her suffering quickly. You've become so skilled at guiding confessions that subjects now anticipate your questions and provide appropriate answers without prompting. Martha's detailed description of diabolic meetings includes specific elements: the number of attendees, the rituals performed, the supernatural abilities granted that appear in dozens of previous confessions, because you've unconsciously shaped all of them to fit the same narrative template. The psychological weight of this realization compounds with accumulated trauma from hundreds of previous cases. You begin experiencing what medieval physicians would call melancholia, but modern medicine would recognize as severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Sleep becomes elusive, interrupted by dreams filled with the voices of people you've tortured over the years. Your professional performance begins to deteriorate in subtle ways that authorities initially don't notice. You start making procedural errors, failing to document session details properly, applying torture techniques with less precision, occasionally forgetting to obtain required signatures on confession documents. These mistakes represent your psyche's unconscious rebellion against continuing your work. The isolation that has always defined your profession becomes unbearable as your mental state deteriorates. Alana notices your increasing withdrawal, but doesn't understand its cause. Your son Hans, now 14, begins avoiding you entirely, sensing the darkness that surrounds you even when you're not working. The few social connections you maintained with other outcasts begin to fray as your depression makes you unreliable and unpleasant company. Physical symptoms manifest alongside psychological ones. Your hands, once steady enough to apply precise pressure with delicate instruments, develop tremors that interfere with technical torture procedures. Headaches become constant companions, particularly after lengthy interrogation sessions. Your appetite disappears, leading to weight loss that makes you appear skeletal and intimidating even when trying to be reassuring. The breaking point arrives during a session with Klaus, a baker accused of using witchcraft to make competitors' bread moldy. As you prepare to begin standard interrogation procedures, Klaus looks directly into your eyes and says something that shatters your remaining professional composure. You look more afraid than I do. In that moment, you realize that Klaus is correct. Your terror of what you're about to do exceeds his fear of what's about to be done to him. You've become more traumatized by your profession than your subjects are by experiencing it. The psychological damage from years of inflicting pain has accumulated beyond your ability to compartmentalize and continue functioning. You find yourself unable to proceed with Klaus's torture session. Your hands shake too violently to operate the equipment properly. When you attempt to speak the required legal formulas beginning the interrogation, your voice breaks and fails. For the first time in your career, you're forced to postpone a torture session due to your own incapacity rather than the subject's condition. The postponement creates administrative complications that reveal how dependent the local legal system has become on your services. Court schedules are disrupted when interrogations can't be completed on time. Other cases are delayed while authorities try to determine whether you're temporarily indisposed or permanently unable to continue working. What disturbs you most during this crisis is the realization that your breakdown threatens not just your livelihood, but the entire judicial process in your region. There's no backup torturer available, no redundancy in the system that is evolved around your specialized expertise. Your psychological collapse could effectively shut down legal proceedings for serious crimes across multiple communities. But perhaps most terrifying is your growing awareness that recovery might not be possible. The psychological damage from decades of professional torture work may have permanently altered your capacity for normal human function. You might have become so psychologically contaminated by your profession that redemption is impossible, even if you abandon the work entirely. Your son Hans is now 16, and the time has come for him to begin his formal apprenticeship in the family profession. This transition, which you've dreaded since his birth, becomes the catalyst for a crisis that will fundamentally alter the trajectory of your bloodline's cursed inheritance. The legal requirements are clear. As the hereditary torturer's son, Hans must begin training to eventually assume your position. Local authorities have already issued the apprenticeship documents, and church officials have blessed the arrangement. Your own deteriorating psychological condition makes succession planning urgent. If you become unable to work, there must be someone qualified to maintain essential judicial services. Hans's reaction to his mandatory career path is unlike anything you experienced at his age. Where you accepted your inheritance with resigned obedience, he responds with active rebellion. He refuses to enter the torture chamber, declaring that he would rather die than follow in your professional footsteps. His defiance is so complete that he begins sleeping in the stable rather than under the same roof as your torture equipment. What makes Hans's rebellion particularly devastating is his articulate criticism of your profession's moral foundations. Unlike previous generations who accepted torture as divinely ordained necessity, Hans has been exposed to emerging scholarly debates questioning whether forced confessions serve justice. He quotes Augustine and Aquinas to argue that torture corrupts both the torturer and the legal system it serves. Your attempts to explain the economic necessity of continuing the family profession fall on deaf ears. Hans points out that your accumulated savings, carefully invested over decades of professional work, could support the family without requiring him to inherit your spiritual contamination. He proposes alternative plans: apprenticing as a craftsman in a distant city, joining a monastic order, even emigrating to regions where your family's reputation wouldn't follow. The conflict escalates when Hans begins actively sabotaging your equipment. You discover that torture instruments have been deliberately damaged, screws loosened on the rack, strappado ropes cut partially through, thumb screws jammed with small stones. These acts of sabotage could have resulted in equipment failures during torture sessions, potentially causing subject deaths that would bring serious legal consequences. Local authorities become concerned when word of Hans's rebellion spreads through the community. The continuity of essential judicial services depends on hereditary succession in your profession. If Hans refuses to accept his inheritance, there's no established mechanism for training a replacement torturer. The entire regional legal system could be disrupted by your son's moral awakening. Church officials attempt to intervene, sending Brother Augustine to counsel Hans about accepting God's plan for his life. But Hans's theological knowledge proves surprisingly sophisticated. He argues that deliberately inflicting suffering contradicts Christ's teachings about mercy and compassion. He quotes scripture passages about forgiveness and redemption that directly challenge the moral foundations of judicial torture. The most painful aspect of this conflict is how it forces you to confront the true nature of your life's work. Through Hans's eyes, you see your profession not as necessary public service, but a systematic spiritual corruption that has contaminated your family for generations. His refusal to continue the bloodline's curse becomes an implicit condemnation of every choice you've made. Helena supports Hans's rebellion, revealing that she's harbored similar doubts about your profession for years. She admits to praying nightly that Hans would find a different path, that the cycle of inherited spiritual contamination might end with your generation. Her confession adds another layer of isolation to your already fragmented existence. The crisis reaches its peak when Hans announces his intention to publicly renounce his inheritance during Sunday Mass, formally declaring before the entire community that he rejects his destined profession and asks God's forgiveness for his family's sins. Such a public renunciation would be unprecedented and potentially catastrophic for your position. Local authorities threaten severe consequences if Hans follows through with his planned renunciation. They suggest that refusing hereditary obligations might be considered a form of treason, that Hans could face imprisonment or forced exile. These threats only strengthen Hans's resolve. He declares that any punishment would be preferable to accepting your spiritual inheritance. Your own response to Hans's rebellion surprises even you. Despite decades of professional conditioning that emphasize duty and obedience, you find yourself secretly admiring his moral courage. Part of you hopes he succeeds in breaking free from the family curse, even if it means the end of your professional legacy. The conflict forces you to make a choice that will define the remainder of your life. Continue pressuring Hans to accept his inheritance, thereby perpetuating a cycle of spiritual contamination you've come to question, or support his rebellion and face the consequences of ending your bloodline's hereditary profession. What disturbs you most is the realization that Hans's rebellion has awakened moral doubts about your profession that you've spent decades suppressing. His refusal to inherit your curse is forcing you to confront whether that curse was ever justified. The date is March 15th, 1378, and you're conducting what will unknowingly be your final torture session. The subject is Father Benedict, a parish priest accused of celebrating black masses and corrupting communion wafers with diabolic rituals. The case should be routine by now. You've extracted hundreds of similar confessions from alleged heretical clergy, but something about this interrogation will fundamentally change your understanding of your entire profession. Father Benedict is 71 years old, nearly blind, and so frail that you're unsure whether he can survive even mild torture applications. The charges against him stem from testimony by previous torture subjects who named him as a leader in diabolic activities. As often happens in witch trial cascades, earlier confessions have created networks of accusations that ensnare increasingly prominent community members. What's immediately different about this session is Father Benedict's response to your standard intimidation procedures. Instead of showing fear or attempting to negotiate, he begins questioning your techniques with scholarly curiosity. He asks about the theological justifications for each torture method, requests citations from canonical law supporting specific procedures, and challenges the legal foundations of forced confession. As you apply preliminary torture, binding his hands with increasing pressure to encourage cooperation, Father Benedict begins delivering an impromptu lecture on the history of confession in Christian practice. He traces the evolution from voluntary spiritual unburdening to coercive legal extraction, arguing that torture-induced confessions represent a fundamental corruption of sacramental principles. His resistance to pain is remarkable but different from the heroic endurance you witnessed in Brother Thomas years earlier. Father Benedict doesn't seem to be consciously resisting torture through willpower or spiritual strength. Instead, his advanced age and deteriorating health appear to have diminished his capacity to experience pain normally. The same techniques that would break younger subjects barely register with his failing nervous system. This physiological resistance forces you to escalate your methods more rapidly than usual, applying increasingly severe torture to achieve any response. But as you intensify the interrogation, Father Benedict's scholarly commentary continues uninterrupted. He discusses the technical aspects of your equipment, compares your techniques to torture methods described in classical texts, and even offers suggestions for improving your procedural efficiency. The breakthrough comes when Father Benedict begins describing your profession from the subject's perspective with startling insight. He explains how torture victims learn to anticipate interrogators' expectations, how they develop strategies for providing satisfying confessions with minimal detail, and how the entire system has evolved into elaborate theater where both torturer and subject perform predetermined roles. His analysis is devastatingly accurate. Father Benedict describes techniques you use unconsciously, the leading questions, the emotional manipulation, the careful pacing of pain and relief. He explains how subjects learn to read your reactions and provide responses that will satisfy your professional requirements while minimizing their suffering. Most disturbing, he demonstrates this knowledge by crafting a perfect diabolic confession in real time, showing you exactly how false admissions are constructed. You want me to confess to celebrating black masses, Father Benedict says calmly as you apply thumbscrews to his arthritic fingers. I should describe meeting with other corrupted priests at midnight, desecrating communion wafers by mixing them with unholy substances, and teaching diabolic prayers to innocent parishioners. Would you like me to name specific accomplices, or shall I provide general descriptions that could apply to anyone you might wish to accuse next? The confession he provides is masterful, detailed enough to satisfy legal requirements, dramatic enough to justify severe punishment, and comprehensive enough to generate additional accusations against other community members. But he delivers. It is an obvious performance, making clear that he's manufacturing false testimony according to formulas learned from observing previous torture sessions. What shatters your remaining professional confidence is Father Benedict's final observation. You know I'm innocent. I know I'm innocent, and yet you'll record my confession as evidence of guilt, because that's what your profession requires. We're both trapped in a system that transforms lies into legal truth through the application of pain. His words force you to confront a reality you've spent decades avoiding. Your expertise lies not in detecting guilt or extracting truth, but in manufacturing false confessions that satisfy predetermined legal requirements. You've become skilled at producing theatrical performances of guilt rather than investigating actual innocence or culpability. As you complete the paperwork documenting Father Benedict's confession, you realize that you can no longer maintain the psychological compartmentalization that has allowed you to function professionally. The pretense that your work serves justice has finally collapsed entirely, leaving you face to face with the reality that you've spent your career destroying innocent people to satisfy institutional demands for confession-based convictions. Father Benedict is executed 3 days later, burned at the stake for diabolic crimes he didn't commit based on a confession was entirely fabricated. But the most disturbing aspect of his execution is how little it differs from hundreds of others you've facilitated throughout your career. In the sleepless nights following Father Benedict's execution, you begin a grim accounting that will consume the remaining months of your career. Sitting at your wooden desk by candlelight, you methodically review decades of professional records, attempting to calculate the human cost of your life's work with mathematical precision. The ledgers reveal statistics that would be impressive if they documented any other profession. Over 27 years, you've conducted 1,847 formal interrogation sessions. Of these, 1,623 resulted in confessions leading to executions. An additional 187 subjects died during torture sessions before confessions could be obtained. technical failures in your professional terminology, but human lives nonetheless. You discover patterns in your data that disturb you more than individual cases ever did. Your confession success rate improved dramatically after your 5th year of practice, stabilizing at approximately 94% for most crime categories. Witchcraft accusations yielded confessions in 98% of cases, while simple theft or fraud cases had slightly lower success rates, around 89%. These statistics represent professional expertise, but they also document your growing skill at breaking innocent people. The economic calculations are equally disturbing. Your torture sessions generated approximately 340,000 silver coins in legal fees, property confiscations, and related judicial revenue over your career. This figure doesn't include secondary economic effects: families destroyed, businesses shuttered, communities disrupted by cascade accusations stemming from torture-induced confessions. Your profession has been remarkably profitable for everyone, except your subjects. Geographic analysis reveals that your work has affected every community within a 50-mile radius of your base of operations. Some villages lost 15% of their adult population to torture-based prosecutions. 3 small hamlets were completely abandoned after witch trial cascades eliminated enough residents to make continued settlement economically impossible. Your professional footprint extends across the landscape like a plague. The demographic breakdown of your subjects provides another layer of horror. Women comprised 67% of your cases, despite representing only 52% of the regional population. The elderly were disproportionately represented, particularly in witchcraft accusations. People with physical disabilities or mental illnesses appeared in your records at rates far exceeding their presence in the general population. Your profession systematically targeted society's most vulnerable members. Family destruction statistics proved particularly devastating. Your records show 847 cases where torturing one family member led to accusations against spouses, children, or relatives. The average witch trial cascade affected 4.3 additional people beyond the original subject. Some accusations spread through entire kinship networks, eliminating bloodlines entirely through execution or forced exile. Professional development metrics demonstrate your growing efficiency over time. Early in your career, obtaining confessions required an average of 6.2 torture sessions per subject. By your peak operational years, this figure had decreased to 2.8 sessions per confession. You became more skilled at breaking people quickly, which reduced their suffering but increased your capacity to process additional cases. The medical documentation in your records reveals the physical toll of your profession on subjects who survived. Interrogation. Permanent disabilities resulted from 23% of your torture sessions. Joint dislocations, broken bones, nerve damage, and traumatic injuries marked hundreds of people who lived to bear witness to their encounters with your professional expertise. But perhaps most disturbing are the children's statistics. Despite legal protections from minors, your records show 89 subjects under age 16. The youngest was 8 years old, a girl accused of using diabolic powers to spoil milk after her family's cow became ill. These cases reveal how institutional pressure to obtain confessions gradually eroded even the most basic ethical constraints. Quality control analysis of your confessions reveals their manufactured nature with mathematical clarity. Certain phrases appear in hundreds of different cases. Specific diabolic meeting locations are described identically by subjects who never met each other. Supernatural abilities are confessed to in nearly identical language across decades of interrogations. The repetitive nature of these confessions demonstrates systematic coaching rather than genuine testimony. International comparison data gathered from correspondence with torturers in other regions shows that your professional performance exceeded Regional averages in most categories. Your confession success rate ranked in the top 15% among practitioners in the Holy Roman Empire. Your subject survival rate was better than average, indicating superior technical skill in pain application. These comparative metrics would represent professional excellence in any other field. The temporal analysis reveals how external events influenced your workload. Plague years generated 340% increases in witch trial accusations. Political instability. Periods saw 280% increases in treason and heresy cases. Economic downturns correlated strongly with increases in theft and fraud prosecutions. Your profession served as a social release valve, providing scapegoats during times of community stress. As you complete this numerical accounting of your career, the weight of accumulated suffering becomes quantifiable in ways that individual cases never were. You haven't just tortured 1,847 people. You've systematically dismantled entire communities, destroyed hundreds of families, and manufactured thousands of false confessions that justified predetermined executions. The mathematics of your profession reveal a truth more horrifying than any individual case. You've spent your career operating an efficient system for converting innocent people into legal justifications for their own deaths. The morning of September 23, 1378, brings visitors to your door who will force the final confrontation with your profession's legacy. A delegation arrives consisting of Brother Marcus, a church investigator, Magistrate Wilhelm, representing secular authorities, and most surprisingly, Anna, the surviving daughter of Klaus the baker, whom you tortured to death 24 years earlier. The delegation's purpose is initially unclear. Brother Marcus explains that recent theological developments have raised questions about the validity of confessions obtained through torture. New scholarly work argues that forced testimony contradicts divine principles of free will and voluntary confession. The Church is conducting a review of torture-based prosecutions to assess their theological legitimacy. Anna's presence transforms this administrative review into something far more personal and devastating. Now 43 years old, she has spent decades researching her father's case and dozens of others involving your professional services. Her investigation has uncovered evidence that many torture subjects were innocent of the crimes. They confessed to under duress. What makes Anna's research particularly damaging is its meticulous documentation. She has gathered testimony from surviving family members, analyzed confession documents for inconsistencies, and compared torture-induced accusations against verifiable historical evidence. Her findings demonstrate systematic patterns of false confession production across hundreds of cases. The specific evidence she presents regarding her father's case is devastating. Klaus confessed to poisoning communion wafers through diabolic means, but Anna has discovered that the deaths blamed on his bread actually resulted from ergot contamination, a natural fungal infection that periodically affects grain supplies. The 3 parishioners died from accidental poisoning that had nothing to do with supernatural intervention or Klaus's baking practices. Anna's broader research reveals similar patterns in dozens of other cases. Accused witches confessed to causing livestock deaths that resulted from documented disease outbreaks. Alleged heretics admitted to supernatural crimes during periods when their supposed victims can be proven to have died from natural causes. The elaborate diabolic conspiracies extracted through torture consistently fail to correspond with verifiable historical events. Brother Marcus requests access to your professional records to support the Church's theological review. The implication is clear. If confession-based prosecutions are found to be spiritually invalid, everyone involved in the torture process may face ecclesiastical consequences. Your decades of professional service could be retroactively condemned as sinful rather than divinely justified. Magistrate Wilhelm's concerns are more practical but equally threatening. If torture-induced confessions are declared legally invalid, property confiscated from executed subjects might need to be returned to their surviving families. The economic foundations of the judicial system you've served could collapse if your professional expertise is officially discredited. The confrontation forces you to acknowledge truths you've spent years suppressing. You admit that many torture subjects were probably innocent, that confessions were often manufactured to satisfy institutional expectations, and that your professional techniques were designed more to produce legally acceptable testimony than to uncover actual guilt. Anna's response to your admissions is more devastating than anger would have been. She expresses pity for the psychological burden you've carried, acknowledging that you were trapped in a professional system that demanded spiritual corruption. Her forgiveness somehow feels worse than condemnation. It forces you to confront the possibility that your life's work was not just evil, but tragically unnecessary. The delegation's investigation reveals the broader social context of your profession's development. Torture-based prosecution systems evolved not because they effectively identified criminals, but because they provided institutional mechanisms for managing social tensions through scapegoating. Your expertise served political and economic functions rather than judicial ones. You wake one morning in 1487 to find your hands shaking uncontrollably. It's not the cold. Your chamber is warm from the brazier that never stops burning. It's something else entirely. Something that's been building for months, like pressure in a sealed vessel. The faces of the innocent haunt your dreams now, and you've begun to recognize a terrible pattern in your work. The merchant's daughter from last spring, the young priest accused of heresy in autumn, the baker's wife who supposedly practiced witchcraft. You remember their eyes, not the defiant glare of the guilty, but the confused terror of those who genuinely didn't understand why they were there. And you remember how quickly they confessed to crimes you now realize they never committed. In Nuremberg, torturer Hans Vollmann documented this exact phenomenon in his personal journal, discovered centuries later. He wrote of sleepless nights, of a growing certainty that at least half his victims were innocent, and of the crushing realization that his skill at extracting confessions was precisely the problem. The better you became at your craft, the more innocent people you destroyed. You've learned to read the difference between genuine guilt and manufactured confession. The guilty often hold out longer, their stories consistent even under extreme duress. The innocent break quickly and say whatever they think you want to hear. Their fabricated confessions changing with each session as they desperately grasp for words that might end their suffering. But recognizing innocence doesn't grant you the power to save them. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, demand their pound of flesh. You've tried subtle sabotage, loosening restraints, applying less pressure, giving subtle hints about what confession might spare them. But your supervisors watch you closely, and any sign of mercy is seen as weakness or, worse, corruption. The church records from Toledo reveal that torturer Miguel Santos was himself tortured and executed in 1489 for showing excessive leniency toward heretics. His crime? Allowing 3 victims to die from their injuries before they could confess, which officials interpreted as deliberate sabotage. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had extracted confessions from hundreds met his end on the same devices he had operated. You begin to understand that your position is a trap within a trap. Society needs someone to blame for the horrors you inflict, but they also need you to inflict them. You're simultaneously indispensable and despised, protected and expendable. The very skills that keep you employed guarantee your eventual destruction. Your hands continue to shake as you prepare for another day's work. Today's subject is a young mother accused of poisoning her neighbor's well. You've seen the evidence, testimony from 3 witnesses who all tell exactly the same story and exactly The same words. Someone coached them carefully. As you descend to the chamber, you realize that tomorrow it could easily be you strapped to these devices, confessing to crimes you never committed, while another torturer looks into your eyes and wonders if you're truly guilty. But there's something else waiting for you in that chamber today, something that will change everything you thought you knew about your profession. The woman strapped to the rack before you is different from the others. Maria Gutierrez, a midwife from the village outskirts, doesn't beg or weep or proclaim her innocence. Instead, she studies you with eyes that seem to see straight through. Your executioner's hoot to the terrified man beneath. And when she speaks, her words chill your blood in ways that years of screams never did. "I know who you are," she says quietly as you approach with the heated irons. "You're Johann the baker's son. Your mother came to me when you were born breech. I saved your life with these same hands you're about to destroy." The iron slips from your grasp, clattering to the stone floor. In that moment, your carefully constructed wall between your professional and personal identities crumbles completely. This isn't some anonymous victim. This is the woman who brought you into the world, who saved your mother's life, who delivered half the children in your village. Historical records from the Spanish Inquisition revealed dozens of similar cases where torturers discovered personal connections to their victims. In 1491, Inquisitor Thomas de Torquemada himself had to transfer a torturer named Carlos Mendez after it was discovered he had been assigned to interrogate his own godfather. The psychological trauma was so severe that Mendez spent the remainder of his life in a monastery, unable to speak above a whisper. Maria continues speaking as guards look on impatiently. She tells you about the herbs she gathered to help your mother's fever when you were 7. The broken arm she set when you fell from the church roof at 12. The blessing she gave you when you left the village, even though she somehow already knew what dark path you'd chosen. "They say I poisoned the well," she continues, her voice growing weaker. "But you know I've spent my life bringing water to lips that needed it, not taking it away. They fear me because I know which wives beat their husbands, which merchants cheat their customers, which priests break their vows of chastity. A midwife sees everything, Johann. And sometimes that knowledge becomes dangerous." You realize she's been condemned not for witchcraft, but for knowing too much truth about too many powerful people. Her death isn't justice, it's convenience. And you're the instrument of that convenience. The guards grow restless. Your supervisor enters to check on your progress. But instead of reaching for the instruments of torture, you do something unprecedented in your career. You kneel beside the rack and quietly ask Maria what really happened to the well. She smiles sadly. "A merchant's son fell into it while playing. Rather than admit their negligence and pay compensation to the village, his family claimed the water was cursed. They needed someone to blame, someone expendable. As the truth settles over you like a heavy shroud, you understand that this moment represents more than just another innocent victim. This is your reckoning, the point where you can no longer hide behind duty, necessity, or survival. You stand slowly, your decision crystallizing like frost on winter glass. Today, for the first time in your career, you will refuse. Your refusal echoes through the chamber like a physical blow. "I will not torture this woman," you announce, your voice carrying a strength you didn't know you still possessed. The words hang in the air as guards exchange glances, and your supervisor's face darkens with rage and disbelief. Within hours, you find yourself in shackles, condemned by the same system that once employed you. The irony is perfect and terrible. The torturer becomes the tortured, the hunter becomes the hunted. As they drag you to a cell, you catch a glimpse of Maria being released quietly through a side door. Sometimes, in medieval justice, one sacrifice could spare another. Your execution comes swiftly. In the records of Seville, 1487, The brief entry reads, Johann Brenner, formerly in service as questioner, executed for treason against the Holy Office. May God have mercy on his corrupted soul. No mention of the innocent lives you saved through your final act of defiance. No acknowledgement of the courage it took to break free from a system that had consumed your humanity piece by piece. But your story doesn't end with your death. In the decades that follow, something unprecedented happens across medieval Europe. Other torturers begin to refuse to resist, to break the chain of brutality that defined their profession. Some historians trace the beginning of the end for judicial torture to individual acts of conscience like yours. Anonymous men and women who finally said no, when saying yes had become unbearable. The profession of torturer, already despised and psychologically devastating, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. By the 16th century, many regions struggled to find anyone willing to take the position. The combination of social isolation, spiritual damnation, physical danger, and psychological trauma proves too much even for the most desperate souls. Medieval torture officially ended not because of enlightened thinking or humanitarian progress, but because the system finally consumed itself. The torturers, brutalized by their work, abandoned by society, haunted by their victims, simply couldn't continue. The machinery of cruelty ground to a halt when the people operating it finally broke down completely. Today, when we read about medieval torture, we focus on the victims and the methods, the politics, and the power. We rarely consider the human cost paid by those forced to wield the instruments of suffering. Yet their stories, buried in forgotten records, whispered in confession booths, carved into prison walls, reveal a truth about the nature of institutionalized cruelty that echoes through the centuries. Every system of oppression requires willing participants, and every participant pays a price. The medieval torturer's life reminds us that when we create monsters to serve our purposes, we must remember those monsters were once human beings, and their humanity, though buried, never entirely disappears. In the end. Perhaps that's why it truly sucked to be a medieval torturer. Not just because of the danger, the isolation, or the condemnation, but because somewhere deep inside, beneath years of brutality and conditioning, a tiny spark of conscience remained. And eventually, inevitably, that spark would demand its reckoning. Your story ends in 1487, but the truth you died for lives on, that no system of cruelty, no matter how entrenched or necessary it claims to be, can survive when enough people choose. Conscience over compliance, humanity over duty, and truth over the terrible convenience of looking away.